Whataboutism. This is when someone tries to deflect criticism by pointing out something wrong that someone else did. Ad hominem. This happens when someone attacks the person making an argument instead of addressing the argument itself. Hasty Generalization. This happens when someone jumps to a conclusion based on a small sample size or limited evidence. Cherry picking. This occurs when someone selectively chooses evidence or data that supports their argument while ignoring other evidence that contradicts it. One example is a store that only displays positive reviews and ignores negative or neutral reviews from other customers. Strawman. This occurs when someone distorts their opponent's argument by oversimplifying or exaggerating it. False cause. It's when you think one thing caused another thing just because they happened around the same time, but they're actually not connected. For example, if you wear your lucky socks and your team wins a game, it doesn't mean your socks caused the win. Circular reasoning. This occurs when the evidence offered to support a claim is just a repetition of the claim itself. Burden of proof. This fallacy occurs when someone claims that their argument or position is right simply because there hasn't been enough evidence presented to prove them wrong. For example, someone declares that aliens currently live on Mars because no one can prove him wrong, then he considers his claim to be valid. Appeal to emotion. This fallacy occurs when emotion like fear, pity, or excitement is used as the primary persuasion tool than using concrete evidence and sound reasoning. For example, someone is trying to make people feel guilty and compassionate to encourage donations, rather than explaining how the money will be used effectively. The Fallacy Fallacy. This occurs when someone concludes that just because an argument is poorly made or contains a logical fallacy, the conclusion must therefore be wrong. Slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy is when someone argues that a small step or action will lead to a series of negative consequences. Tu quoque. Tu quoque is like saying, you do it too, so it's okay for me to do it. It's basically avoiding the issue at hand by pointing out someone else's hypocrisy. Personal incredulity. This fallacy occurs when someone finds something hard to believe or understand, so they assume it must be false. Special pleading. Special pleading is when someone argues that a rule or standard should not apply to their situation, without giving a good reason for the exception. The loaded question. This fallacy occurs when someone asks a question that has an assumption built into it. For example, someone asking, "Have you stopped cheating?" It assumes that you have cheated in the past, even if you haven't. No matter how you answer, you will look guilty. Survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is like only seeing the winners and forgetting about the losers. For example, people talk about Bill Gates who dropped out of college and became super rich. But people don't know that there are more college dropouts who fail. Ambiguity. This fallacy happens when a word, phrase, or statement has more than one meaning, and those meanings aren't clearly distinguished. The gambler's fallacy. This is when someone believes that future probabilities are affected by past events. It's like thinking that if a coin has landed on heads several times in a row, it's due to land on tails next. But in reality, each coin flip is independent, and the chances are always 50-50 no matter what happened before. The bandwagon. It means believing something is true or good just because a lot of people believe it or do it. Just because soda is popular and widely consumed doesn't mean it's the healthiest option. Appeal to authority. This happens when someone relies on someone's authority or status rather than the evidence or reasoning behind the argument. It's like saying, well, the professor said so, so it must be true. Just because an expert says something doesn't automatically make it true. Sometimes even experts can be wrong. The Fallacy of Composition. This is when you assume that what's true for a part must also be true for the whole. The Fallacy of Division. This is when you assume that what's true for the whole must also be true for its parts. No True Scotsman. This fallacy occurs when someone makes a claim, and when there's an exception to that claim, they just change the rules to exclude the exception. Genetic. This occurs when you judge something based on where it came from, rather than its truth. Black or white. This fallacy happens when you are faced with only two choices without any middle ground, even though there are actually more possibilities. Appeal to nature. This fallacy occurs when someone argues that something is good or right simply because it is natural, or bad because it is unnatural. This is like saying herbal medicines are better than synthetic medicines. Just because something is natural doesn't automatically make it better or worse. Anecdotal. This fallacy occurs when someone uses personal experiences or stories as evidence to support a claim. It's like saying, I know a guy who smoked and lived to 100. There could be other factors at play, and one person's experience doesn't represent everyone's. The Texas Sharpshooter. It's when someone finds a pattern in random data and then claims that pattern proves their point. It's like a marksman shooting randomly at a barn, then painting a target around the tightest cluster of bullet holes to make it look like they're accurate. For example is the Ramsey curse. When Ramsey scores a goal, a famous person dies afterward. This is a fallacy because famous people die all the time even without Ramsey scoring. Middle ground. It happens when someone argues that the truth must be somewhere between two opposing positions. Red herring. It's when someone changes the topic of a conversation to something else to avoid answering a question. The slothful induction. It happens when someone refuses to believe something is true, despite plenty of evidence showing that it is. The appeal to ridicule. This fallacy happens when someone tries to dismiss an argument by making fun of it or mocking the person making the argument, instead of addressing the actual points. Argument from repetition. This fallacy happens when a statement or claim is repeated so often that people begin to accept it as true without critically examining the evidence. For example, a politician who keeps saying, I am the best candidate for the job, in every speech, interview, and advertisement without providing any reasons or evidence to support the claim. Over time, some people might start to believe it. Appeal to tradition. This fallacy happens when someone argues that something is good or right just because it's been done that way for a long time, without considering whether it is the best choice. Proof by verbosity. It's when someone tries to win an argument by talking a lot without actually addressing the main point. Appeal to motive. This is when someone tries to discredit an argument based on the person's motives, instead of addressing the argument itself. Non sequitur. This is when someone makes a conclusion that doesn't logically follow from the arguments. The association fallacy. This is like assuming that because two things are related, they must be the same. Just because something is associated with something else doesn't mean it has the same qualities. No limits fallacy. This is when someone says there are no limits to something just because we haven't seen any limits. For example, if a horse has never shown signs of getting tired, someone might wrongly argue that the horse can never get tired. This way of thinking can be misleading, because not seeing a limit doesn't mean there isn't one. Undistributed middle. It's when someone assumes that because two things share a common characteristic, they must be the same. Affirming the consequence. It's when you jump to a conclusion without considering all the possibilities. It's like saying, if it's raining, the ground will be wet. The ground is wet, so it must be raining. That's a logical fallacy. It could be that the ground is wet because someone just watered the grass. That doesn't mean it's raining. Half-truth fallacy. It happens when someone tells you something that's partly true, but leaves out important details that make it misleading. It's like saying, I did my homework, but not mentioning that you only did half of it. The truth is there, but it's not the whole story, which can lead people to the wrong conclusion. The misleading vividness fallacy. This happens when people focus on a dramatic or emotional example rather than looking at the bigger picture. For example, if you hear a story about a plane crash and start thinking flying is dangerous, even though statistically flying is very safe. The fallacy of accident. It happens when someone applies a general rule to a specific case that it doesn't really fit. The reverse fallacy of accident. It happens when someone applies a specific case to a general rule that it doesn't really fit. Argumentum ad nauseum. It's when someone keeps repeating the same argument over and over again, even if it's been proven wrong or irrelevant, in hopes that you'll eventually give up or be convinced. Existential fallacy. It happens when someone assumes that something exists just because a statement about it is made. For example, if someone says all unicorns have horns, it doesn't mean unicorns actually exist. It just means that if unicorns did exist, they would have horns. Fallacy of exclusive premises. This happens when you have an argument with two negative statements and try to make a conclusion from them. From these two negative statements, you can't logically conclude anything about cats and pets because the premises don't give you enough information to connect them.